You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app, or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
It was a pretty strong jobs report today. I'm not necessarily sure we can characterize this one as a blowout, but still an upside surprise on the non-farm payrolls figure and on wages, and a downside surprise on unemployment, which held at 3.7%. And of course, the low unemployment rate, holding below 4% for a 23rd consecutive month, is something that President Biden has touted repeatedly and touted once again today. He actually put out a statement that said, quote, "This report confirms that 2023 was a great year for the American worker." But if it was a great year for the American worker and potentially a great report for the president, was it the same for the Federal Reserve or for markets that are betting that the Fed is going to be cutting rates in the not so distant future? Let's get a take on that now. I'm pleased to say Bharat Ramamurti is joining me. He is now Senior Advisor for Economic Strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project, but he's also former Deputy Director of the National Economic Council. Bharat, thanks so much for being here. Do you still look at this labor market and see an economy in need of rate cuts?
Well, I think as you described it, it was a solid, not spectacular jobs report. I think it's important always to look at the revisions in addition to what the report said for the last month. And if you look at the downward revisions over the past couple of months and look at the 3-month trend, what you have is solid, but not spectacular numbers. And I think, again, that is, broadly speaking, what you would expect to see at this stage of the cycle. There's relatively little sign of weakness in the labor market. And while inflation is clearly trending downwards, it's not at target yet. And for those reasons, I am somewhat skeptical that the Fed is going to cut starting in March. I know that that's what the expectations are. I'm a little bit more skeptical of that. Now, I think that they should, because I think it's good to be proactive on this front, but I'm skeptical that they will.
Okay, I'm not sure that many market participants, at least today, necessarily join you in that view. We have seen some pulling back of expectations really since the Fed released minutes earlier this week that indicate maybe they aren't thinking cuts are coming imminently. And yet that does seem to be where the market is. For the American voter, for the American worker, is it more optimal to have this continued strength in the labor market if it means interest rates stay high? Or is it actually better to see some of that weakness coming through, but that also brings lower borrowing costs with it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that people underrate the importance of having a strong job market. People think of it as, well, maybe a couple million additional people are unemployed, but everybody else is basically the same. That's not really true. When you have additional slack in the labor market, that affects people up and down the income spectrum. When there's a tighter labor market, companies have to compete harder to make sure that they retain workers and that they attract workers. That creates upward pressure on wages across the income spectrum. And so I think everyone benefits from a tighter labor market. Of course, reduction in interest rates would lead to improvements in things like housing affordability and the cost of credit. I think it really affects people, different people in the income spectrum differently. I think for folks who are on the market for housing, for folks who are looking for credit, the lower rates could mean some amount of increase in affordability. But I think really at the end of the day, we shouldn't be rooting for an increase in the unemployment rate. It really is extraordinarily valuable to have the kind of tight labor market that we've had for the last almost 2 years at this point.
Well, and something that has kept that labor market tight is participation that was lower. And I wonder what you make of the participation figures today. It fell to 62.5%. That's the lowest level we've seen in almost a year. Is that concerning?
Yeah, a little bit. I think that the participation figures can always be a little bit noisy. It's always good to look at longer term trends. When I was in the White House, we tend to look at 3-month and 6-month averages rather than month to month. I would say that it's a blinking yellow light at this point. I'm not ready to declare that there's some sort of clearly negative trend happening yet. But you're right. Ultimately, what you want to see and what we have seen over the course of this recovery is that the prospect of good jobs has attracted a lot of people off the sidelines and into the labor force. And that increase in labor supply has been a helpful element of bringing inflation down in a very healthy way. And so you don't want to see that trend reverse. I'm not ready to declare that that trend is reversing yet, but it is something to keep an eye on as we go into future jobs reports.
Okay, so let's talk about the trend in inflation. How much do you think the Red Sea and what's happening there, the disruptions to transport, the elongating of these vessels' journeys around the coast of Africa, higher freight costs as a result, maybe even higher fuel prices, depending on actually what happens in the Middle East? How great a risk is that to the inflation story?
It's certainly a risk. I mean, look, during the pandemic and in the aftermath of the pandemic, we saw how exactly these types of supply side disruptions can contribute to rather sharp increases in inflation. Remember, during the pandemic, we saw in some cases a 10x increase in the cost of ocean shipping, which then flowed through to increases in the cost of all sorts of products that American companies and American consumers rely upon. I think you could see to a lesser degree that kind of upward pressure on prices because of these disruptions. It's one of many reasons why it would be useful to try to resolve that as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and of course, you speak of supply chains. Progress made on supply chains is something that this White House has frequently touted, just as they have frequently touted the low unemployment rate, all of the job growth that has happened under Biden's presidency. And yet it hasn't, as you well know, reflected necessarily in polling, in his economic approval rating. Now that you're outside the White House, looking in, what do they need to change to actually get that to resonate?
Honestly, I don't think that they need to change course very much. I think that what you are seeing in terms of the disconnect in economic data and economic sentiment is mostly explained by the fact that there's always going to be a lag. Look, we in the White House celebrated when wages started rising higher than inflation and real wages turned positive. But if you're an ordinary person out there, you're not going to switch on a dime the second that real wages tick over from negative to positive. You want to see a sustained set of time when inflation is coming down, your take-home pay is clearly allowing you to pay for the things that you need at the grocery store and at the pump. And I think what you're starting to see now that it's been several months of real wage gains, inflation is starting to recede a bit, is that the sentiment data is ticking up. You see it in the consumer board information, you see it in the Michigan sentiment data, you see it in some of the polling data about the president's economic approval. All of that stuff is starting to tick up. And I would be surprised if it doesn't continue to tick up over the next several months as the salience of inflation recedes.
Well, the ticking up, though, of those confidence metrics probably is reliant on the fact that we actually don't get a recession, that the landing is soft. Do you think that's fully assured at this point?
I'm hesitant to say that anything is fully assured. If there's one thing I learned from my time at the White House is that you have to expect the unexpected. But I would say that all of the data that we have available to us right now about the state of the labor market, about consumer spending, about business investment, all seems to suggest that we are going to have a soft landing. Now, there are things that can disrupt it, as you just noted. Some of the disruptions on the shipping side could send inflation moving in the wrong direction. You could have other geopolitical events that could end up pushing us in the wrong direction. But based on the data that we have available to us right now, we're certainly on a path to a soft landing. I know that Secretary Yellen made a similar point just earlier today. So I would have a lot of optimism on that front. And if, in fact, we can secure that soft landing, and what we have over the next several months is inflation at or near the target, continued steady job growth, I would be very, very surprised if you don't see consumer sentiment and economic sentiment go up quite a bit in the months to come.
How much does fiscal risk factor, though, into ultimately economic outcomes? Knowing Congress is getting ready to return to Washington next week, there's going to be a big fight over appropriations ahead, with the threat of not just a shutdown, but potentially a 1% cut across the border sequester come April if they really can't sort this out. How concerned should we be from an economic standpoint?
I think from a macroeconomic perspective, we shouldn't be overly concerned. If you look at analyses of past shutdowns, for example, I was working on Capitol Hill back in 2013 when there was a month-long shutdown. The data tends to suggest that has a pretty limited impact macroeconomically. Now, of course, there is a significant impact on people's lives, on millions of federal employees, on people who rely on certain forms of government services who are not going to get those in a shutdown. And if you see some sort of prolonged, locked-in reduction in government spending over the long term, that would be a risk. I don't think we're at any risk of that happening. If we're going to have some sort of 1 week, 2 week shutdown as people sort out these issues, I don't think that's much of a risk from a macroeconomic perspective.
All right, Bharat Ramamurti, thank you so much for joining the program on this Jobs Day. He is Senior Advisor for Economic Strategy at the American Economic Liberties Project and, of course, former Deputy Director of the NEC, reflecting on today's Jobs Day. Let's get the reflections now of our wonderful Bloomberg politics contributors. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with me. So, Jeanne, I'll pose the same question to you that I essentially asked Bharat a moment ago. Is Biden actually able to use a jobs report like this to his advantage when he hasn't been able to tout the strength of the economy successfully much at all?
He's got to keep reminding people that the numbers look very good. And at the same time, to acknowledge that, as you were just talking about, there is a lag. And so they may not be feeling that yet due to the inflation pressure. So, it is a very hard line for the president to walk, but it is an astonishingly good report. 23 months, Kailey, you mentioned, it's stunning numbers that are much better, I think, than anybody could have expected. And hearing Janet Yellen talk about the fact that this soft landing may be in the offing, that is all very good. It hasn't translated politically yet, unfortunately, for the president. But the team feels fairly confident that in the coming months, as that we beat that lag, that they may be able to benefit from it politically. But it's a hard message to sell when people are still feeling inflation as they go to the store and elsewhere.
Well, and Rick, knowing that Biden has really struggled in terms of actually getting voters to recognize his economic accomplishments, is that why we're seeing such a big deal made? Perhaps actually you could even call it a kicking off fully of his election year campaign efforts in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, to talk about Donald Trump being a threat to democracy. Is this really his best remaining strategy?
Yeah, look, obviously that linked to his his speech today, linked to January 6th, the anniversary of that. It draws you to that conclusion to talk about democracy under threat. But the reality is he can't give enough speeches about the economy. As Jeanne points out, he is not considered credible on this. He's got one of the lowest presidential ratings on managing the economy. Trump beats him significantly. And he's got to fix that if he wants to get a second term. The good news is, as pointed out in today's report, he's got plenty to talk about. But I've yet to see this administration really fan out around the country to promote what he likes to call Bidenomics. And one speech a month is not going to get it done.
Well, Rick, how much would he be helped by Fed cuts, knowing how familiar you are with timing in campaigns and how it may work for you or against you? At what point will minds already been made up enough on the economy that therefore even Fed cuts aren't going to change the mind of a voter? Or I guess that's just my question. Does it matter when the cuts come, or people will already have made decisions by the point that they do?
Yeah, it matters. What we're seeing right now is what we historically have seen in campaigns, which is a pretty significant lag between any kind of good news and an improvement in the ballot, improvement in the public image of the president around something like the economy. It seems voters are always negatively inclined. If there's something bad happens, they change their mind immediately. But when good things are happening, it takes a month, 3, 4, 5, 6 months to really internalize the improvement. So the sooner the Fed could act, if they do, on rate cuts, the better it would be for Biden. He has not got much credibility on inflation and fighting it. More voters will tell you in a focus group that they didn't take it seriously than the fact that, they're doing what they need to do to tackle it. And so the same will apply. If the Fed starts to cut rates soon, there'll be a lag, but that lag will actually, I think, inure to the benefit of the Biden campaign.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino will be sticking with me. Just a note on how voters are feeling about the economy. Producer James points out the Suffolk USA poll earlier this week, 30% said they think we're in a recession. Only 29% said they think it's an economic recovery, 21% stagnation, and 16% depression. So not necessarily encouraging for the incumbent administration. But coming up, we're not going to talk about the incumbent. We're going to talk about the Republicans trying to kick him out of the Oval Office in this 2024 cycle. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Welcome back to the fastest show in politics, and talk about things going fast. Iowa already is almost upon us. We are in the middle of now a 10-day countdown. It is just 10 more days until the all-important Iowa caucuses, where, yes, it is highly likely that former President Donald Trump is going to win. Polls show him ahead by a significant margin, polling at north of 50% in a lot of polls. So I'm not sure we can call it a real contest yet. The question is, can Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis put up a strong enough showing in Iowa that it becomes more of a contest? They certainly are competing fiercely for the second place position here, and they were each making their cases last night in CNN town halls. Interestingly, though, they took more barbs at Donald Trump than each other, which is a bit of a reversal from what we've seen so far this cycle. Here's Ron DeSantis last evening.
Do you think Donald Trump is not pro-life?
Of course not. I mean, when you're saying that pro-life protections are a terrible thing, by definition, you are not pro-life. When you say that you want to have a federal law at 18 weeks or 20 weeks that would override a state like Iowa that has enacted pro-life protections, that would mean more abortions, not less abortions.
He went on to also criticize the former president for failing to keep his promises on the border wall, as well as spending. Meanwhile, here's Nikki Haley on Trump.
For me, it's not about guilt or innocence. It's about what's in the best interest for the country. And I don't think our country will move forward with an 80-year-old president sitting in jail that allows our country to continue to be divided. We have to move on past that.
She also said chaos follows Trump and that the country can't take another 4 years of chaos. So on that note, let's bring back Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino, our Bloomberg Politics contributors. So, Rick, what'd you make of their hits at Trump last night? Were they strong enough?
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time we've seen them both, as you point out, lean in against Trump and not lean into each other. So I think they've figured out who's actually winning the election so far. So that's instructive, too. I think that the attacks are nothing new. They've kind of reprised these throughout their campaign. But the fact that they've ramped up many of them in the same event is indication that they're feeling a little bit of the pinch. I would say much more important for DeSantis to contrast with Nikki Haley, because if there's any chance that he gets a, quote, ticket out of Iowa, it means he's got to come in second. I can't imagine a scenario where he comes in third and is currently polling anemic figures in New Hampshire. And the two of those things in combination are a death blow to his campaign. Wouldn't surprise me that he has an election night in Iowa like Howard Dean did in 2004, where there's a little bit of screaming occurs.
Okay, I want to get back to how the margin of second may matter here and what that ultimately means for New Hampshire. But Jeanne, first I want to ask you about something else Nikki Haley frankly had to talk about last night, which was her Civil War gaffe, the idea that she did not attribute slavery as a cause of the Civil War previously. And part of her response, she said, and this is a quote, "If you grow up in South Carolina, literally in second and third grade, you learn about slavery. You grow up and you have, I had black friends growing up." Does that help her get out of the hole or dig it deeper?
Digs it deeper. This was a huge misstep by Nikki Haley a few weeks ago. She keeps getting asked about it. And, I thought she actually performed pretty well last night. But as you wake up and you see the Twitter feeds and you see what's being reposted and shared from the night, that line that you just mentioned, Kailey, about "I have black friends," that's really what we're left with. And so that is a problem for her. And so, is it going to be a wound she can't recover from? Absolutely not. But I think in many people's minds, it's indicative of what DeSantis and Christie and now Donald Trump, as he's hitting her more forcefully as he sees her rising in the polls in New Hampshire, have said is that she is trying to be all things to all people and that she is not authentic, not saying what she actually believes. I think there was actually like a 9-year-old kid in New Hampshire who asked her the other day, something about her being a flip-flopper like John Kerry. I don't know how a 9-year-old remembers John Kerry, but that's what's in people's minds. And so I do think it's problematic for her. I thought, again, she did a good job on the night, but when, in this media era, when everything is shared, that's the clip we're seeing of her. It does become a bit of a problem for her.
So it raises the question of how strong a showing she might actually be able to put up in 10 days' time. So, Rick, to return to you on the question of, obviously, Donald Trump is going to lead Iowa, barring something completely unforeseen. It's about number 2 and how close number 2 is to Trump number 1, right? What kind of margin does Nikki Haley actually need to make New Hampshire actually in play?
Yeah, first of all, she's already got New Hampshire in play, right? In all the most current polling, she's hovering around 10% behind Trump. That is way up from just 6 months ago. So New Hampshire is a race today. And so what she's trying to do is figure out what she can do to add to that momentum, which is why she's placed a massive $30 million buy in Iowa. And with all due respect to social media, when you've got $30 million worth of commercials pounding away in 3 media markets in Iowa, you're controlling the message. And the message that she has is that she's electable. She can beat Biden. And that's what Republicans want to hear. They care a little bit less about DeSantis and Nikki Haley than they do about Joe Biden. And so if you tell them that you can beat Biden and you show it in the polling data that's circulating, you've got credibility. And so she's actually waging a pretty credible argument, and it undermines Donald Trump's arguments of electability. So it works both in New Hampshire and in Iowa. So if she does sort of surprise everybody and come in second in Iowa, she will get a boost going into the New Hampshire campaign. And then the question is, what can she do with it? If DeSantis comes in second place, it's pretty much what he has said all along that he was going to do. In fact, he's actually said he was going to win Iowa, which was a mistake. But then the question is going to be, where does he go from here? Because he has no campaign in New Hampshire. He has no campaign in South Carolina. There aren't a lot of Super Tuesday states that are good for DeSantis. And so he'll have to come up with a narrative on election night that says somehow he can go from here to, from Iowa in second place to a victory somewhere. And at least Nikki can point to the fact that she is closer to Trump than any candidate has been since Ron DeSantis got into the race in New Hampshire. So all eyes will shift immediately from Iowa to New Hampshire, and we'll see whether or not its impact, the Iowa election, has anything to do with the New Hampshire outcome.
Well, we'll also see, Jeanne, if there are just fewer candidates in play come New Hampshire. It's not just a question of whether Ron DeSantis moves on past Iowa, but there are other players in this game as well. Chris Christie and Vivek Ramaswamy. How likely is it in your mind that we see a consolidation of the field before we actually get up there to Manchester?
We really should. I mean, if you think about Chris Christie's campaign, it was predicated on ensuring that Donald Trump is not the nominee of the party. Well, if that's the case, and he has zero paths, and really he has less than zero path to victory here, then you would think he would bow out and allow his supporters to go where they go. Maybe Nikki Haley, maybe they look elsewhere. But, I think we should see something like that if he was true to what he said. And of course, Vivek Ramaswamy, he's barely showing in the polls at this point. He really does seem to be playing for a vice presidential or a cabinet spot at this point. I don't know if he's going to need to make a statement because he already seems out of it. But, I do think that the really interesting question is going to be for Donald Trump, who keeps talking about his 50, 60 point, 40 point victory and lead in the polls. And what happens if either of these candidates, in DeSantis or Haley, does better than expected? It's a dangerous game Donald Trump is playing by making that case. And, he's going to have to eat that if one of them or both of them does far better than expected, which is possible given DeSantis's ground game in Iowa and what Rick was just talking about with Nikki Haley's money in Iowa that she has to spend on the media.
Yep, 99 counties visited for Ron DeSantis. Donald Trump himself hasn't really spent much time in Iowa at all, though he will be there next week when he's counter-programming the Haley-DeSantis debate with a Fox town hall. So obviously all of us are going to be tuned in. We got to talk about Congress returning to Washington next.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, and the Bloomberg Business app. Or listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts.
Congressman Chip Roy, of course, Republican from Texas, I actually spoke with him on Balance of Power last night and asked him about this idea that it's either shut down the border or shut down the government. And this is what he told me.
We need to pass H.R. 2 or we need to withhold funding until we get it. I mean, if you read Federalist Papers, if you look at the founding of our country, our job, Article 1, is to hold the funding and to use it to force an administration that is ignoring the law to do their job. Here's my question. What would people have us do? Just say, whatever you want to do, Alejandro Mayorkas, whatever you want to do, Joe Biden, blatantly ignore the law while people die? And so, to all my Republican colleagues who are going around going, oh, we might have a shutdown. What happens with the government? You go talk to the people of Texas or people in your community.
That was Congressman Chip Roy. Let's get another view now from another Republican member of the House. Congresswoman Nicole Malliotakis of New York, I'm pleased to say, is with us now. Congresswoman, thank you so much for being here. Do you agree with this strategy? Shut down the government if you don't get what you want at the border?
Well, look, I think it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, I believe in good faith negotiation. I think we have to try to use our leverage, right, in this process to push the Senate to make real advances in border security, which means we have to revert to some of the policies of the previous administration. But we need to have a negotiation. I would say we passed H.R. 2, right? That was the House Republicans' priorities. And basically, it's what Customs and Border Protection, if you spoke with their union, that's what they're saying they want, okay? They want technology, they want tools and resources, manpower, but they also want policies that restore the order at the southern border, that undo President Biden's executive orders. It addresses some of the asylum issues. It addresses some of the issues with visas. And I think it would be really it would be a tremendous resolution to what we're seeing at the southern border. Now, the Senate doesn't want to pass our bill, then the Senate should pass its own bill. Let the Senate pass its own bill of what it sees as priorities relating to the border, and then let's negotiate and reconcile the differences. We passed our bill in May. And yet we have Senator Schumer refusing to not only allow our bill to the floor for a vote, which I strongly believe if Schumer brought H.R. 2, Border Security Act, to the floor for a vote, it would pass. He refuses to allow a vote. All we're asking for is an up and down vote. If it doesn't pass, then we got to start from scratch. Or pass your own bill, and then let's reconcile those differences. But what we're seeing happening is so unsustainable. It is so destructive to communities like ours here in New York City. The mayor is screaming, saying that this is going to bankrupt New York City. They're going to freeze hiring police officers, across the board cuts. And yet Senator Schumer, who represents New York City, refuses to take any action. So we have to use whatever leverage we have. I don't want to shut down the government, but we need to demand that border security be part of this resolution. We're not going to continue to give money to Homeland Security to simply process paperwork. They actually need to secure the border.
Okay. So, Congresswoman, you speak of negotiation and this idea that the Senate should come up with something of their own and pass it first. Yet there are many members of your conference who are saying H.R. 2 essentially or nothing, that H.R. 2 ultimately is all they settle for. So if you're Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, is that all he can settle for? Or you think actually, knowing what happened to the prior Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, he's going to be able to pass something passed by Democrats in the Senate in this House of Representatives?
Well, look, H.R. 2, I think, is an ideal piece of legislation. However, I'm a Republican from New York. I'm in an overwhelming Democrat state, and I know that we have to negotiate with the Democrats, as much as I may not like it sometimes, to get anything done. And so what I would say is H.R. 2 is the Republican starting point. But that's why we need Senator Schumer to either allow a vote on our bill okay, which again, I think it would pass if he brought it up, even though the Democrats control the Senate, or pass your own bill, and then we can reconcile the differences. And we would have to give a little. Yes, we'd have to give a little. But certainly, as long as our main provisions, right, that would make sure people are not released in the interior of this country, making sure that people have to wait in the next safe country as they apply for asylum and go through an orderly process so our courts are not backlogged to the point where they are right now, which is a 10-year wait, making sure that we add more judges to alleviate this backlog, making sure that we're not taking these individuals who are paying the drug cartels to cross our southern border before the people who have come legally and have been waiting in the system for years. Right now, the way the system Joe Biden has it set up is the border crossers are being heard first. And so the people who have been waiting patiently, doing everything right, following the rules, didn't pay the drug cartels to come here, they're getting pushed to the back and they're getting years-long delays. And I know this because I've been working personally with many cases, constituents, and I've had to cut through this bureaucracy and red tape for them. And it's very unfair that the president's prioritizing the people who pay the drug cartels to be smuggled here, as opposed to the ones who have been waiting in the system. So I would simply say is I understand there's a give and take here, but it's hard to negotiate with the Senate when they've passed nothing. We need to see what their priorities are, right? That's how it works. We show you our cards, you show us yours, and then we try to reconcile the differences and get a piece of legislation passed.
So, Congresswoman, there's the Senate and the House obviously in play here, as well as the White House, because Biden's ultimately going to have to sign this legislation. And knowing that Biden does need a win on border policy politically, do you think there is another actor here for House Republicans in the man who is very likely going to be running against him in the general election in 2024? How much influence does Donald Trump have on the people in the House making these decisions right now?
Well, I don't think I think the House Republicans want border security. That is our number one priority. We want to see reasonable policy. And yes, we have legislation to add more visas for people that want to come and work and provide for their families in industries that we need workers, right, to address our labor shortage, and it should be strategic, and we should be doing that. But this idea that we're just going to allow 10 million people to enter our country, 2 million of which we don't know who they are, where they are, or what their intention are, that's the number that CBP estimated has entered our country, is very dangerous when we know fentanyl is killing a record number of Americans. We know that there's sex trafficking, children, women being exploited. When we know that we've caught terrorists at the border that are on the FBI watch list. I mean, this is insane that we would have this type of open border policy in a post 9/11 world. So I think the House is working independently, and this is their priority, regardless of any other national figures. I mean, we see this as a real issue, both economic issue, a public safety, national security issue, and it just needs to be addressed. And if Joe Biden will not do something like rescind the executive orders that created this, his executive orders that created this mess, then we need to take action. We got to use every tool and leverage that we have to get the Senate to act.
Well, Congresswoman, you say the House is going to make these decisions independently of any actor. So is that essentially you saying even if you do have the former president potentially making noise about a deal, that Mike Johnson and House leadership, which pretty much everyone has endorsed him at this point, would pass it anyway?
Look, I think you'll have the votes. If we actually get the Senate to work with us and we can hash out an agreement that would reinstate some of the Trump-era policies, address the issues of visas and asylum and work permits for people who are going to come legally and follow the proper path, then you would see what you usually see in these types of scenarios, right? Like you did in the debt default, you did it with avoiding the shutdown. You'll see the far right vote against it, the far left vote against it, and then everyone else in the middle voting for it. Over 300 probably members voting for it. That's what usually happens at the end of the day when there is a negotiation. The extremes sit it out, they vote no and complain about it. And then the middle, who actually have to govern, right? We pass the legislation, do what we can. People have to understand that Republicans We control 1/3 of the government, right? The Democrats have the Senate, they have the White House. We need to negotiate. We're not going to get everything we want, but if we can get some really good wins that actually address the crisis and stop this mass migration flow to New York City that's hurting cities like ours and we can't afford it, and we're seeing citizen services being cut as a result, well, then that's a win and we should do it. Regardless of who, at the end of the day, will take political credit for it, we need to do the right thing.
Okay, well, you've mentioned New York a few times, so let's talk specifically about what's happening there. Obviously, dealing with an influx of migrants, many of which have been bused from Texas. And I'm sure you saw the news yesterday. New York is now suing 17 Texas bus companies for $708 million to recoup costs incurred by providing shelter and services to these migrants. Do you agree? Do you support that move, Congresswoman?
Look, I support any tool that's going to stop this flow. I think a lot of the problem of these non-government organizations, these NGOs that receive a lot of government funding, they are responsible for transporting the majority of the migrants. Yes, states like Texas are sending some, but that's about 10 to 15% of the individuals that we're seeing in New York City. So I support any measure that will stop it. But truly, what's really going to stop it is if we secure the border, right? At the end of the day, it comes down to that. And so I really urge Mayor Adams to get Senator Schumer to act. And he calls for more funding. Which would only exacerbate the problem, right? It would just allow him to open up more shelters and more encampments in New York City, and it may help the city financially, but doesn't really solve the problem. What's really going to solve the problem is having border security and a reasonable process for people, which we do, by the way. We have laws, and for generations, people have been coming, including my own parents, to this country. We have a process in place. It needs to be followed. It needs to be enforced. And that's what we need. And we need more resources to make sure that these cases are heard quicker.
Congressman, finally, I only have a minute left with you, but I do want to make sure to ask this question. How confident are you that a partial shutdown on January 19th can be averted?
You know, I think there's a lot of variables right now, so it's hard to say. Look, they've said we were going to shut down.
Is it more likely than not?
I would say a partial shutdown would be more likely than a complete shutdown. But I also think that, people have said we were going to have shutdowns twice before in this Congress, and we didn't. We averted it last minute, working in a bipartisan way. But at some point, we need to see policy changes. We don't want to just continue the existing funding levels. We have a $34 trillion debt. We need to be serious about spending, and we got to find savings. And so that is why negotiating is so important right now.
All right. And on that note, we will leave it. Congresswoman, thank you so much for your time. Safe travels back to Washington next week. That is Republican Congresswoman from New York, Nicole Malliotakis. We'll have much more coming up next on the second hour of Sound On, so stick with us. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Sound On podcast. Catch the program live weekdays at 1 Eastern on Bloomberg Radio, the TuneIn app, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
We want to get more on the jobs figures now because 216,000 payrolls added in the month of December. Economists thought it would be 175,000. And rather than a 3.8% unemployment rate economists were looking for, what we got was 3.7. Wages were a little hot as well. So what does all this mean? And what does it mean specifically for the Federal Reserve? Let's get more insight now with Bloomberg's international economics and policy correspondent, Michael McKee, who is also in New York. So, Mike, I guess my first question is it as strong under the surface as meets the eye?
Not quite, and it's a little weird under the surface. There are a number of different oddities in this report, none of which are really going to matter to the Federal Reserve. But the 216,000 has to be weighed against the 71,000 that were subtracted from October and November, so you get a net of 145,000. And we were running in the third quarter at about a 225,000 average pace, so clearly there's a deceleration here. And the fact that the unemployment rate did not go up was because a lot of people left the labor force, but most of those people didn't lose their jobs. They just were not in the labor force, so they're not counted as unemployed. So we don't know exactly why they went out, other than maybe it was the holidays and they didn't feel like looking for work or something like that. And finally, and this gets into the political side of things, the unemployment rate for blacks and for Asians went down, while for whites it went up. And usually if you're going into a recession or something like that, it works the other way. So a lot of things to consider when looking at this report. But as I said, I don't think the Fed is going to change its views one way or another based on this.
Well, Mike, I guess it's important to recognize here that the Fed's views on cutting may be different than the view the market has adopted on cutting, because the market thinks the Fed's going to be cutting a lot more than was suggested in the dot plot, or frankly was suggested in the minutes from the Fed's December meeting that were released this week. They talked about how they wouldn't essentially rule out another hike. There was no suggestion that rates aren't going to stay higher for a longer period of time. So I guess, is what changed here, or what could change, more market interpretation than actual Fed interpretation, because the Fed may have been thinking things all along that are supported by this data?
Yeah, I know what you're trying to say here. It is a weird situation.
I'm not sure I succeeded, so please help me, Mike.
I said on television earlier today that the Fed and the bond market are kind of married, but they're not sleeping in the same bed. They're not even sleeping in the same house. They're quite far apart, and that has to change. How it changes will depend on the data. We had a very weird day today where inflation went up in Europe. It wasn't unexpected, but it went up in Europe, and all of a sudden the markets priced out a number of ECB rate cuts. Same thing happened in the United States with the jobs report. They price out rate cuts when the Fed, when the employment numbers came out. And then that ISM number came out, the ISM services, which showed a slowdown in the service industries, a big drop in prices, and an even bigger drop in jobs that wasn't confirmed by the payroll report. But it was enough that all these markets, futures markets, did a U-turn and now are back to pricing in March moves. So if you can explain the bond market thinking to me, you're doing better than most people. I think basically what you end up with is people are taking advantage of cheap options on the idea of maybe kind of hedging against the possibility that the Fed might actually end up, if inflation goes down, cutting rates in March. Those options may fall off if the data don't support what we're doing, and it's not like you're actually shorting treasuries or something like that.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael McKee answering a question that I'm not sure actually I even asked as a question, but well done, Mike. Thank you so much, as always. We really appreciate it. Of course, Mike, the expert on all things monetary policy, but we want to talk to an expert now on fiscal policy, because as we've talked about already on this program, it's going to be a battle over appropriations, and it's going to start in just a few days when Congress returns to Washington after a multi-week holiday break. The issue on the table, figuring out these 12 appropriations bills by January 19th or February 2nd, depending on what department of the government you are talking about. And depending on who you ask within the government, they may be feeling more or less confident about the ability for a shutdown to be averted. Shalonda Young, who's the White House's budget director, said this morning, "I'm typically optimistic. Don't mark me down as optimistic this morning." So how optimistic is our fiscal policy expert, Bill Hoagland? He is the senior vice president at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So, Bill, how are you feeling?
Thank you, Kailey. I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. How's that? There's good news coming out literally in the last few hours as it relates to an agreement being reached on what we call the top line for appropriations. It is critical for the appropriation process to work the 12 bills to get them completed, that we have an agreement on the overall level of discretionary spending, both defense and non-defense. And there is very strong indications that we are very, very close to getting to that agreement here in the next, it may be even announced later today or early tomorrow. The importance of that is once you know the top line, which we haven't had an agreement since we thought we had the agreement way back with the Fiscal Responsibility Act back last June. But of course, we went through a number of iterations since then. But now we're back to where we should have been back last year. We have an agreement that's being reached that appears to be very close to this Fiscal Responsibility Act agreement last spring, and that will allow then the appropriators to move forward by completing their bills. Quite frankly, I do believe it's very, very difficult, though. Let's be fair, Kailey. I think it's going to be very difficult in 8 days, essentially 8 days, to get the agreement as it relates to the first tranche, which is Department of Energy, Agriculture, Housing and Urban Development, and Transportation.
So, Bill, even if we do, to your point about the difficulty of achieving all of this in such a short period of time, even if you have the top line figures now, potentially knowing how hard it was to come to that in the first place, how much harder is it to figure out everything underneath, how that money is actually divvied up within these programs?
Well, of course, the Senate committees have been working. Staff have been working for some time. The House too. It'll take some time. I guess what I want to say is I think that for that first round of 4-8 major agencies that has a deadline here of January the 19th. My guess is it's going to require them to extend that agreement maybe into the second tranche, which is February the 2nd. And I think they can get that all done within that time frame. Yes, there's a lot of decisions to be made, but I think a lot has been done behind the scenes. So I am, as I say, cautiously optimistic that we'll not have a shutdown for those 4 agencies, but it will require that there's an agreement to extend that first tranche, the January 19th date, to probably to February the 2nd with all the other 8 bills.
Would that extension count, though, as a short-term CR of some kind? Because Speaker Johnson said he wasn't going to do any more of those. But is that, frankly, his only way out of this pickle?
I think it's either that or a government shutdown for those 4 agencies. So I believe that once we get to where the belly up to the bar, so to speak, you're going to be able to work out an agreement. Yes, we make a lot of announcements, and I think we'll find out here. Now, I want to make very clear there's one other issue here. This is just the funding for the fiscal year that we're currently in, fiscal year 24. Yeah. This has nothing to do with the supplemental request that's still pending, $106 billion. This is the one that has to do with Ukraine, Israel, the issues around the border. That's still a separate issue to be debated.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because I'm not really sure the border issue is separate to the appropriations process anymore. The rhetoric we're hearing from Republican members of Congress is shut down the border, shut down the government. How much more complicated does this all become if the border security deal is now what is contingent upon keeping the government funded?
Well, then that's a new element here. As I say, I've heard this: shut down government or shut down the border. I think that's a little bit overstating it. Once again, a little bit dramatic in their statements because we're talking about, first of all, funding the basic government and then the issues associated with that emergency supplemental. I think you can negotiate the emergency supplemental and the border issues separate and apart from the basic funding of the Department of Agriculture, Energy, Transportation and Housing. I think those are really separate issues, and I believe that the appropriators and the leadership at the end of the day will separate the two out.
Okay, so even if the issues are separated, though, how hard is it going to be to find bipartisan compromise on this issue? This is an issue that reforms have evaded Congress for literally decades, Bill. So what makes this time different? Is it really different?
No, I think you're absolutely correct, Kailey, that the issue associated with the emergency supplemental, that's separate and apart from the basic funding. I think that is going to still continue to be very contentious, whether or not they can reach an agreement here. I think it's still very problematic on that score. I do think that there is a real desire on the part of particularly the members in the Senate to find a solution here. And it will not, listen, let's be honest, even if we could find some improvements upon the border, whether it be through the parole issues or other issues down there, I do think that that we're not going to solve all the problems of the border in this one particular bill. But one thing that's important is to keep in mind that emergency supplemental was to provide additional funding to the border for exactly for what is needed in terms of the border judges and things of that nature, and the border guards and all that, which are necessary to strengthen the border and protect the border here. So again, I want to try to keep the two separate from the basic fundings of the federal government for fiscal year 24. But you're absolutely correct. I think it's going to be very difficult, and we're not there yet, clearly. But at least the United States Senate, in a bipartisan manner, is trying to work overtime to find a solution. Now, whether even if the Senate could get an agreement, whether that would be acceptable in the House is still very much up in the air, as the new speaker has interjected himself and says that he wants to negotiate directly with the White House. That will further delay any kind of agreement going forward on the border.
So, Bill, let's talk about the new speaker. Can Mike Johnson get through all of these different fights and still have the gavel in hand on the other end of him?
I have to believe it's going to be tough for him. He's going to have to. He's shall I say, he's learning on the job at the same time. I do think that he will retain his speakership. I don't think the United States House wants to go through the same exercise they went through last October in terms of finding a new speaker at this point, going into a political year, an election year, and where the questions are being raised about whether the leadership in the House can, whether Republicans can retain leadership in the House. I'm not a political pundit in that sense, but I do think the last thing you want is, first of all, to have a government shutdown or to have another fight over the speaker in the United States House of Representatives if Republicans want to retain the House in the next 119th Congress.
And finally, Bill, just in my final moment with you, I want to return to something you said at the top of our conversation, the idea that these negotiators over the deal are indeed close. Is that something you've heard directly from the White House or from the people in the room? And how close exactly is close? Are we there?
It's hard to say this. We're talking about an agreement of spending that's about $1.6 trillion. I am under the impression we're $2 billion away from an agreement. That's coming from within the halls of the Congress today.
All right, Bill Hoagland, it's always great to have you on the program. Thank you so much for providing this insight. He is, of course, the Executive Vice President of the Bipartisan Policy Center and spent a lot of time walking those halls of Congress. I'm sure he still does. Really great to have him.
Thanks for listening to the Sound On podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at 1 p.m. Eastern Time at Bloomberg.com.